aren't anywhere near the number of trees out in the forward area out here as you see right now. In the old days, and for those appreciative of bad humor and irony, there used to be a shell station directly in front down here when there were more private inholdings out here. But, artillery served in groups of 6 called batteries, taken from the old medieval, to batter, and nothing batters better than 6 12-pound cast iron balls flying at 1,800 miles per hour, going right down that way. But at any rate, the cast iron balls are just one sort of projectile that comes out of a field piece like this. You have 2 types of exploding ammunition: a shell, which is a hollow cast iron projectile filled with a gunpowder. Then you have an improved version of that called spherical case, which has a handful of lead musket balls on the inside of it. Both of those sorts are activated by a time fuse, especially coming out of a smoothbore gun like this. And all you have to do is just cut that fuse, and because there is a 1/10 of an inch windage on the inside of this thing, as the ball bounces out, it burns in the atmosphere and will burst. Ideally, if you cut the fuse right about 10 feet above, 10 feet in front of the line, and these folks right here give you kind of a rough imagining of what that infantry line would look like. A line of 1 soldier and 1 soldier with another line of soldiers about 13 inches directly behind, going down company line or regimental line, a great many men bearing muskets. So it's a good target for a battery of artillery to fire at. Now, of course, one difference between this and the VFW Hall howitzer that you have back home, 2 primary ones. This one loads from the front, and there is no shield for the gunners to hide behind when the men with the muskets get up about 400 yards away and start shooting at the gunners. So you have one last kind of ammunition called canister, which is good for about 400 yards, especially with these. And the canister literally is just a tin can about the size of a high-C juice can, filled with 27 1¼ inch cast iron balls. And that basically is designed to protect the gunners and, more importantly, the horses behind that are attached to the limber box, and the horses that pull all of that and the gun back around when everything is being moved around. Literally, you have around 110 men and nearly as many horses that pull the whole unit around and make the gun function and fire. All the men are cross-trained to take over everybody else's position in the event there are casualties, and there will inevitably be casualties from musketry fire and from battery fire on the far side. So that's pretty much the way that works. Infantry and artillery fire along the same line, not like the modern artillery where it's 26 miles to the rear, and Radio Shack makes it a much cushier job to be an artilleryman in the modern era, except from aircraft, which we don't have to deal with. But that's pretty much the way it goes. You like to fire from a higher position here, but both the smoothbore guns like this and the iron rifle guns that you will see in different places with different batteries have the ability to hit from here all the way over there. And there are around 75 of these field pieces that are along Cemetery Ridge all the way down to the Pennsylvania Memorial, to the lower plain of Cemetery Ridge here. There are another 38 or so in the area that we think of now as the National Cemetery. So before Lee begins to even consider advancing 12,500 men into that open field to taste the solid shot, the exploding shell, and the spherical case of the bronze guns and the iron guns that dot all of Cemetery Ridge here, he wants to try and concentrate as much of his own firepower along Seminary Ridge, guns near the railroad cut, and even guns in a position called Benner's Hill, way back of Cemetery Hill, firing against Cemetery Hill to knock out as many Union guns as he possibly can to make it safe for his precious infantry to move up against the center of Cemetery Ridge. That's going to be his plan in detail. But that's counter battery fire. That's offensive use of artillery, and that's going to be somewhat tricky. But it's going to be the heaviest use of concentrated artillery fire. It calls for functional artillery, it calls for functional ordnance, it calls for functional coordination. And in these things, the Federal artillery has the Confederate artillery beaten in spades even before they start. But it doesn't mean that it's not going to be one hellacious afternoon, my friends. This is going to be an afternoon that will be remembered for years and years and years. One of the low-ranking officers of this particular battery, Lieutenant Tully McRae, a recent graduate of West Point of the Military Academy, will call this to mind in 1896 when he says, "Gettysburg has been discussed from every point of view except from that of the artillery, yet every account of that battle refers to the effectiveness of that arm. In this battle, the whole of the artillery in both armies was fought for all it was worth and fully demonstrated the power and influence in battle of this arm when properly managed." This is the one section of the battle when the power of this particular combat arm is recalled, because the noise of this combat, when they get all of their guns going, will be heard in Baltimore, Maryland. That's going to be quite something. But the intensity of the plan is going to be a definite part of what Lee needs to happen for his precious infantry to make it intact to the angle and break the Federal line as part of the assault. Now, in the manual, the roles of the field artillery by the book are, and I'll just run these down and point out the ones that are appropriate here: to attack and defend the works of temporary fortifications, to destroy or demolish material objects, obstacles, or means of cover, and thus prepare the way for the success of other arms. And to prepare the way for the success of other arms, that's what the Confederates hope to do. To break an enemy's line or prevent him from forming, we don't have to worry quite so much about that. To crush his masses, that applies. To dismount his batteries, that applies. That's what the Confederates are hoping to do. To follow and support in pursuit, we had some of that on the second day at the Peach Orchard, but not really here today on the third. And to cover and protect in retreat, not really applicable. But from the manual, that's really the tactical uses of field artillery. And you're going to see the different sorts of artillery pretty much in use on the field armies of both sides as we begin to come in. We're also going to hear from a few very high-ranking folks, very intelligent folks, not so intelligent folks as we go through this, but this is, to my way of thinking, the neatest part of the story, and I'm glad to have you today to share it with you. Now, let's begin to head down over here to the summit of the hill over here for a minute, because I'm so glad that they finally got rid of the old cyclorama building down the bottom of the hill there. And a little bit to the left of that, if you then start looking up at the skyline where the trees meet the sky, you will begin to see a little bit of a needle that sticks up into the sky. Can everybody see that? Yeah. That is the lightning rod on the Culp's Hill Tower. So that gives you an idea of the location of the high point on Culp's Hill. Now, I point out Culp's Hill because a little bit more to the northeast, off in that direction, is the Hanover Road. And it's out along the Hanover Road where Benner's Hill is, that Confederate artillery emplacement. And from there, the Confederate gunners will be able to fire back towards Cemetery Hill. And it's from there back over towards the Peace Light and Oak Hill, and then back along Seminary Ridge, that the Confederates are going to try to have all of this gunfire enfilading back towards this area here, really trying to do the damage into the target area that Lee wants nullified here, so that these guns can't hurt by their fire going out. One of the artillerists in the Confederate ranks was a very smart recent graduate of the military academy at West Point, a fellow by the name of Edward Porter Alexander. And at this point in time, he is serving as the reserve battalion artillery chief under Longstreet, and he will write later of what the intention of this attack was. He said, "My orders were as follows. First, to give the enemy the most effective cannonade possible. It was not meant simply to make a noise, but to try and cripple him, to tear him limbless, as it were. Then further, I was to advance such artillery as could be used in making the attack." Basically a two-pronged responsibility to do those two things. He was not, however, in charge of the overall bombardment. Some folks have written that everything was laid in his lap from Longstreet's Corps all the way out to the Benner's Hill segment. The Confederates, however, do not have a really good coordinator for the entire line of their positioning. That's going to fall to a fellow by the name of William Nelson Pendleton. William Nelson Pendleton is Lee's chief of artillery. And William Nelson Pendleton is a curious and somewhat sad character in this particular role, because Pendleton is a graduate of the military academy in the 1830s, and like many who graduate who find a particular thing to fixate on, which means their brains are pretty good, Pendleton observes that the workings of mathematics are truly miraculous and something to draw inspiration from. And he figures that mathematics, being so precise, must be a gift from the Lord. He pursues that a little bit further and winds up wearing a collar for 30 years, and therefore he does not stick close to any of the new training, any of the new technologies, any of the new drill. And when Virginia secedes, he will decide to go back into the Gunsmoke. He wants to become a gunner again. He will wind up working his connections with Robert E. Lee, because he is Lee's pastor, and winds up becoming the head of the artillery for the Virginia Army, and eventually therefore for the Army of Northern Virginia. But because he has not gotten the latest technical manuals, all of the new stuff that's gone in, he is not as sharp or efficient or as direct. Being a pastor for 30 years somewhat kind of blunts his blade in that regard. Therefore, he is not the direct sort that somebody like his opposite number on the far side, on the Union side, will be. And that gentleman will be a fellow by the name of Henry Jackson Hunt. Henry Jackson Hunt is a third-generation West Pointer from Detroit, and Henry Jackson Hunt is very much an in-your-face, brilliant sort of fellow. If you exhumed him now, cleaned him off, smelled him up a little better, and put him in fatigues, showed him that the gun's load now from the wrong end, and sent him to the desert, he would be arguing with our officers now about the better way to do things. He is that kind of fellow. And when the Army makes its transition from General Hooker to General Meade, the opportunity is there for Hunt to make some changes. Previously, he has been relegated to being a staff officer, making sure all the artillery horses get the requisite number of shoe horses and nails and shells for the guns and things like that. A paper pusher, a job he thoroughly despises, and now he gets back into the game. He will actually make sure that there is a secret supply train of extra unregulated artillery ammunition that follows the Army up here, because when the Army starts moving, the heavy stuff, the food and the artillery ammunition, always is the stuff that gets kicked out to the side to facilitate the movement of men up to the front. Well, he and a number of like-minded artillery officers make sure, because that's the first thing the commanders want, is ammunition, but it's the first thing they kick off the side of the road to get their men up front. So they make sure that they have extra artillery ammunition in the supply wagons to make sure that that will be available and handy. He is that sort of sneaky, efficient sort of fellow. But that's the gentleman that runs the Federal Artillery. He knows every single battery commander's name, first name and last name. He is an amazing sort of fellow. And on the morning of the 3rd, he is inspecting each battery. He believes that all of the batteries in his army are broken down by corps, and there are 4 or 5 batteries in each corps. That's one of the new changes that they make. You don't have to go from division to division begging for a unit of artillery to be able to concentrate them in one spot to be able to fire on the enemy to get a concentrated grouping of artillery together. So this is one of the other changes that comes after Chancellorsville. So it's a very tight system, and it's one that the Confederates actually forced the Federals to adopt after being beaten so many times. So this is one of the things that the Federals are going to find works very, very well for them. It's the artillery brigade system, and it's going to have a couple of kinks toward the end of the story, you'll find out. But this is something that Hunt is believing is all his exclusive command. If it's an artillery piece, it's mine. It doesn't belong to the corps commander in the army in the different corps. So that's the way that works. But at any rate, a vast difference between the 2 artillery chiefs in the army. Now, on the morning of the 3rd, there will be some skirmishing that takes place between the batteries on the opposite side of Seminary Ridge. Some of the folks in the 3rd Corps AP Hill's guns will fire back over in this direction, do some damage, and the reports from that don't seem to promise much. Alexander is very disturbed at that. Number one, he thinks that they're wasting some of their ammunition unnecessarily. I think it'll pay off for them because it gives them an idea just exactly where the batteries are, and that's always good information to know. But again, the Confederates are strung out in a much longer arc than the Federals are, compacted on this interior line that runs from the Round Top over to Culp's Hill in this direction. And if they need to bring up reserves, they have a straight, short interior protected line in which to do so. So they're going to get a very good advantage here in this interior position. Now the bombardment itself actually begins at 1:07 p.m. and this figure is brought down to us by a fellow who worked for the Pennsylvania College, now Gettysburg College, and he's the fellow that also recorded the meteorological conditions on that day, but he writes down in his diary at 1:07 p.m. And Lieutenant Rittenhouse, who commands the regular battery, Battery D, 5th U.S., Nee Hazlitt's battery on the 2nd day until Hazlitt was killed. General Hunt informed me that the enemy seemed to be getting ready, that they would open the way with their artillery, and directed me not to return their fire, but reserve my ammunition for the charge. And this is a key point. Hunt knows that to throw shell after shell back and forth like that is merely to waste ammunition. Most artillery ammunition is good, or is much more effective when you're going after the infantry in the open. Just to throw shells back and forth against does not really gain you much. And so he's actually, General Hunt has actually about that time, about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, ridden down the entirety of the line all the way down to Little Round Top, telling all of his gunners, if they start firing at you, hold your fire until you have real targets in the field. Don't play this game of throwing shell for shell. And before he had time to get away, before General Hunt had time to get away, the first shot was directed at Little Round Top. Now, because it is a supreme moment in history, you know, like where were you when Kennedy was shot or something like this, this will be one of those things that a number of commanders along the way will say, we got it first. You know, and according to the writings for Little Round Top, during the shelling, a fragment took out Battery Sullivan's wheel horse, struck behind the right ear, remaining with the horse a moment, Sullivan bemoaned, "Oh, that was a dumb fine hoss. If it had been the other devil, I wouldn't have killed, but it was a dumb fine hoss." In the same way, the first shot was also supposed to have hit the one of the men in the 19th Massachusetts, which was just south of the angle. At the sound of the first gun, which was plainly a signal, Lieutenant Sherman S. Robinson of Company A jumped to his feet just in time to be hit on his left side by the second shot, which disemboweled him, and his body now lies in the National Cemetery. So again, everybody claims, or a number of people at different times, at the same time rather, claim that they were the victim of the very first historic shot of the bombardment. Now, at the same time, what I would like to do is to take us down just a little bit of the ways down the slope over here towards General Meade's headquarters, because I want to disabuse you of one of the great myths of the bombardment. So that's going to be a really difficult spot, at that particular moment. And a couple of accounts of guard shells fell at General Meade's headquarters with that kind of intensity. Now, to own this house back here, Lydia Leister stayed with the officer that occupied her house when General Meade was the commanding general down here. And it was General Meade's headquarters received its share of destruction. Each one of these monuments here represents a unit that was assigned to be part of the headquarters. If you've ever seen those World War II movies where Eisenhower is down at headquarters and you've got all these guys, the communications guys, the headquarters guards and all that stuff, that's what they were. One shell burst in the yard amongst the staff houses tied to the fence, another tore up the steps of the house, another carried away the supports of the porch, one passed through the door, another through the garret, and a solid shot barely grazed the commanding general as he stood in the open doorway and buried itself in a box by the door at his side. And it wasn't just that. Army headquarters were visited with such a shower of projectiles that 16 horses of the staff and escort were killed before the officers could get away. One officer, seeing his horse badly wounded by a piece of shell, rushed back into the house for his pistol to put the poor brute out of pain, and put 2 bullets instead into a fine uninjured horse belonging to Captain Hall of the Signal Corps. This was the Captain Hall that had been up on Little Round Top the previous day, and would probably have emptied his revolver as he was a poor shot had not Captain Hall interfered.
Oh my God.
A little bit of Keystone Cops amidst the tragedy down here. And of course, when this is all over, poor Lydia Leister has all these dead horses in her yard. And this will be her only source of income, because after all this is over, the fertilizer company comes by and pays her 50 cents a piece per pound for all of the dead horse bones that are out here. Of course, dead horse bones is something of a duplication there. That is something of a difficulty at that particular point, but it gives you an idea of how intense the overshots were. Now, the fact that you're getting a lot of these overshots out here leads one to ask the question that is always asked about this. With all of these overshots, was the whole thing just overblown? And the answer to that is no. It's very spotty, but it is not overblown by any means. Because where we started, at Battery I 1st U.S., the infantry that's supporting that is the 108th, and there is a surgeon amongst the men of the 108th, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Wafer, and he says, "Our artillerymen sprang to their posts at once and replied with more than their usual pluck and spirit, but they were rapidly being overpowered, worsted, and fairly battered out of existence. I could plainly see their caissons being frequently blown up, horses rolled in heaps, tangled in their harness with their dying struggles. Wheels knocked off, guns capsized, and artillerists going to the rear or lying on the ground, bleeding in every direction. Although nearly all the horses were destroyed and one of the 6 dismounted, yet the gallant commander fought them until he had not a round of ammunition left." So, it's very much, no pun intended, a hit or miss affair with the accuracy and the precision of various batteries along the way there. and there were so many rounds of artillery ammunition being fired that you were going to get a percentage of those that flew over the ridge. But many more did their damage on the forward side, on the target side of the ridge. And we will see about those when we return to the crest of the ridge. But I also wanted to come down here and talk a little bit more about one of the intensities and one of the problems that was had on Cemetery Hill while we're still in the position to imagine it with that lump of dirt over there. Because when you have differing ammunition types and differing guns, you will occasionally have things that do not work correctly. And when you have those guns that are firing at you from Benner's Hill, and you have guns that are firing at you from Seminary Ridge, in essence what you have is a crossfire. And that's one of the things that made Major Osborne's position over there on East Cemetery Hill a very dangerous position. It was just good for the Federals that the Confederates did not have the mass firepower to sustain that threat. But from Thomas Osborne's diaries, he talks about what it was like when he had some of his guns up there in that position. He says, an Ohio battery was sent to me from the artillery reserve down the Taneytown Road in that direction. The battery had been under fire but a few minutes when information was brought to me that the men were throwing ammunition out of the chests into some timbers to represent that it was expended and so retire from the field. And here again we have Hunt's brilliance, because he wanted to change that. He wanted the gunners to stand in line until they were relieved or refilled by ammunition wagons that would come up and give you more. Kind of like the way the ice cream truck would come through the neighborhood and sell your kids more ice cream. You know, not give you carte blanche to leave the line, creating holes where you were. I went to the battery, gave the captain some orders in emphatic English, and left him. A few minutes later, several of the men called out, "Look, Major, see the cowards." I did look and saw that Ohio battery with all the men mounted on the ammunition chest, tearing down the Baltimore Pike. I never saw that battery again. Doubtless the captain reported to the commander of the reserve artillery that he was in the hottest of the fight and that he and all his men were heroes. At all events, the giant monument on Cemetery Hill, which is now Huntington's Reserve Monument, close to the fence between the cemetery and the Evergreen Cemetery, stands today to the credit of that battery. And that's his somewhat derisive comment on the affair. But the report of the battery that came in to relieve them at that point, Captain William H. McCartney of the 1st Massachusetts Artillery, says the command was ordered into position to relieve the 1st New Hampshire battery, said to have been out of ammunition. Listen to what he says here. I collected from the ground which had been occupied by said battery 48 rounds of 3-inch projectiles in perfect condition, 22 rounds having been found near the position which had been occupied by one limber chest. But when Edgell got around to filing his report, he says, I expended this day 248 rounds of shell and case shot, making 353 total. The Hotchkiss time shell and the Schinkel percussion worked well, but the Schinkel combination case shell seldom exploded. Now, they did tests on this stuff in 1864 outside Petersburg, and they found out that these things burst once out of every twice that they were fired. Imagine yourself in that situation, and you're getting fire from 2 directions, and you find yourself with something that doesn't work once out of every twice. You going to stand there nobly and continue to try and work it, or are you going to dump it and run? We're talking field artillery here, guys. You know, you're going to dump it and run, and that is what was done. He says, from what experience I've had with this fuse, I think it not reliable. And that, I think, is very much what was done. So, knowing that that was one of the flaws in the system, and that they occasionally have to deal with that sort of thing, they will do that. Now let's come on back here and begin to examine. This bronze in this spot was just a gift, but this is a good visual aid in terms of being able to explain how the drill of the gunners worked. All of the gunners had numbers relative to the job that they did. The gunner, who was usually a corporal, is not visible. He's the one that actually aims the piece. But everybody around the gun doing something here, from carrying a shell to knocking on heaven's door, is somebody who would have a number. This is number 1, the guy here with the staff in his hands. He is at present getting ready to load the piece. He works with number 3 here. What number 3 is doing is what they call thumbing the vent. There's a small ignition hole at the back of the barrel, and he's got his thumb over it right there, and he's somewhere in the process of making sure that it's clean and any sparks were extinguished in the previous fire. While that's taking place, the number 5 is bringing up the shell and the powder in a protective leather sling pouch here. And normally what he would do at this point would be to transfer this to the number 2, so the number 2 can place that stuff into the barrel, and then the number 1 would ram it down, and then the number 5 would return back to the ammunition box for the number 6 and number 7 to make ready to give them the next load. But while that's going on, then the number 3 here would move from thumbing the vent once this guy is clear and stepped back. The number 3 would then take a glorified ice pick made out of brass and then stick it down, open the powder bag, and then work with the number 4, the guy who's stringing out a lanyard you can't see there, and he would hook on a friction primer, a little igniting device, looks something like this, a twisted wire running through a little hollow brass tube that's got a kitchen match composition at the very top, and it's filled with gunpowder in the center, in the real one, and that would hook on to the lanyard there, and then the number 4 would step out. Everybody would make sure they were stepped out. The number 4 would then look to the gunner for the command to fire, and then at that point they would pull the lanyard, pull the igniter, and it would discharge the piece, and it would all shoot out. And in theory, you're supposed to do this according to the manual 1 time every minute, but you can do it when you're firing canister because you don't really have to aim precisely, just point and shoot like an iron Kodak, and at that point you just want to scatter that metal out in front of you. You can do it about 4 times a minute, and that's the way that team would work. And at the end of the back of that manual, where it says drill with diminished numbers, you can work it down to 3 guys, but by that time, hopefully you're hitching up and getting out because that means the enemy's too close for you. But that's the way that would work. Well, I like to pause here and work that so everybody gets kind of a little bit of a visual of how that would work as teamwork there. Around, and the sponge head, which is the other end of that shaft, is dipped in there. And General Hunt is out here riding about during the crest of the bombardment, and he sees that variation that I was talking about. Some areas get hit very badly, and some areas don't get hit, and that some areas get, you know, the overshots that we were talking about earlier. And Colonel Long, Armistead Lindsay Long, who is on Lee's staff at that point in time, is someone who took one of Henry Hunt's classes. Henry Hunt, being that sort of hyperactive, techno-minded sort of personality, went to many of the different military outposts in the late 1850s after having worked with a couple of other Army officers to rewrite and improve the artillery tactics in the Army manual. And so they showed everybody the new tactics and the new techniques and things like this. And at the end of the war, a meeting of many officers that had been all federal officers but then went their separate ways during the war takes place. And General Hunt will write of this following observation. Colonel Long, who was at the time on Lee's staff, had served in my mounted battery expressly to receive a course of instruction on field artillery. At Appomattox, I told him, and this is very much the language of the instructor to the student, I told him I was not satisfied with the conduct of his cannonade, as he had not done justice to his instruction, that his fire, instead of being concentrated, was scattered over the whole field. He said, I remembered my lessons at the time, and when the fire became so scattered, wondered what you would think about it. Well, because of the fact that it was varied in its effects, some of the folks, especially down on the southern end, were definitely going to have their own opinions on it. And because the target area of the bombardment was more towards the upper area of what we now tend to refer to as the angle and the copse of trees area, and there's always been a debate about whether that was the copse of trees intended or that was the copse of trees intended, Ziegler's grove of trees. But the fellow commanding the 2nd Corps, Winfield Scott Hancock, immediately came into his area here. Anywhere where you see the clover leaf on these monuments is 2nd Corps. And he told his battery commanders, I don't care what General Hunt said. You see General Hunt? I don't see General Hunt. And I command this corps, and your batteries exist within my corps, and by gum, my orders are law. And I'm going to tell you that I want your guns to fire at their guns. Now, mind you, we're nearly a mile away, which is close to the effective range of most of these SEAL pieces, because you've got some smooth bores in here as well. And he will begin to order his batteries to fire into the thickening mist. You know, Radio Shack is not open at this point in time. Forward observers are useless, and so they will begin to say yes sir and do it rather than try and dispute all of this. And so they will begin to go back to the caissons back here, dip into their ammunition, and they will begin to fire away their precious long-range ammunition in spite of what General Hunt would think wise. And so that's the way that's going to go. Now, General Hunt will make the following observations as he rides around. I now rode along the ridge to inspect the batteries. The infantry were lying down on its reverse slope near the crest in open ranks waiting events. As I passed along, a bolt from a rifle gun, remember that's the bullet style projectile, struck the ground just in front of a man of the front rank, penetrated the surface and passed under him, throwing him over and over. He fell behind the rear rank, apparently dead. A ridge of earth where he had been lying reminded me of the backwards practice of barking squirrels from trees. And so that's the way that that's going to go. But here in Cushing's battery, you're going to get some interesting developments. You know, the structure here is a caisson, but it's put together by putting a limber next to another two-wheel vehicle, and one of the teamsters is out here and says, suddenly with a shriek, a shell came right under the limber box, and the poor gunner went hopping to the rear on one leg, the shreds of the other dangling about as he went. So there is an intensity of the fire, primarily a gift from the bombardment earlier in the morning when the